Hello, I'm Peter. I'm the creator of Fantastic, a new action tabletop role-playing game which is best described as what you get if you toss D&D, Fire Emblem and Fabula Ultima into a blender to make a beautiful tabletop smoothie. On this channel I talk about game mechanics, both to show off what I'm currently working on in Fantastic and also because it gives you ideas to use in your own games or tabletop RPGs that you might be running. This is actually the first video where I'll be talking about Fantastic, and I'm making the odd decision in focusing on its death mechanics, or more specifically, how a character's story ends. Starting at the end is probably a weird choice, but there is a good reason. Currently, the other Peter, who works on tabletop role-playing games from the Tales from Elsewhere channel, and also Zarek from Odin's Key Gaming, are currently running a community showcase where entrants discuss their approach to death mechanics in tabletop role-playing games. They'll be putting together a playlist of all the entrants, so be sure to check out their channels if you're interested in getting more ideas. Before I talk about my own approach in Fantastic, I think it's important to outline what factors are important in death mechanics, as well as discuss two important examples, D&D 5e and Daggerheart, to see how well they handle it. I think there are probably three major factors to consider when designing a game system's death mechanics: control, impact, and tension. Control represents how much control a player has over their character's end, and it says a lot about the stories the game is trying to create. Do players have very little control and death can take their character at any time due to an unfortunate roll of the dice, or can they end a character's story on their own terms, making sure that they can experience as much of their story as they want before saying goodbye to them? Next, there's impact, which represents how narratively impactful death and dying is in the system. If it's low impact, this means the story doesn't really care that your character is important and life goes on, so to speak. But if it's impactful, then the events of the story are changed by the events during or after their end. This may be less realistic, but it is more narratively satisfying. And then there's tension, which is how much build-up, expectation and uncertainty is created by the rules for dying. Death could be brutally sudden, or it can be drawn out and allowed to be a dramatic moment in the story. There are no right answers to how a system addresses these factors, however a game should consider whether the approach they're taking is right for the kinds of stories it's aiming to create. The death mechanics for grimdark fantasy, 80s inspired action movies, or Studio Ghibli-esque stories are all going to take very different approaches, and so will offer different levels of control, impact and tension. To see these factors in play, let's look at an example most players will know very well, D&D 5e. In D&D 5e, players arguably have very little control over their character's end. When a character is reduced to 0 hit points, the player will on their turn roll a d20. If the result is less than 10, then they gain a failed death saving throw. If it's 10 or higher, they get a successful death saving throw. If they fail 3 times, they die. But if they succeed 3 times, they stabilize and they stop dying. There is more to it than that, of course, but to cut a long story short, the result is random. The player typically has nothing they can personally do to make sure the result turns one way or the other. For stories where death is something which can happen at any time, this lack of control works very well. It fits well with the darker stories which older editions of D&D aim to tell. But the 5th edition of the game has become more of a heroic action style storytelling engine, which is about long epic tales of good triumphing over evil rather than grim dark you could die at any time type of stories. And we can see this play out in how both DMs and players will go to huge lengths to stop a character's story ending too early, either through fudging the dice, scaling encounters to be on the less lethal side, or players consistently choosing options to stop a character's death through either healing or resurrection. This leads to the game feeling in conflict with itself, not quite knowing whether the game wants to give players a lot of control or none at all. With regards to impact, there's no real impact. Death just happens and the party is down a player. The character can't affect the plot anymore, and the player is simply expected to start rolling up another character sheet as soon as possible. Not having an impact on the story again makes sense for an old version of D&D, where death itself can be meaningless and just a consequence of not seeing a deadly trap. But with the current stories it's used to tell, this lack of impact falls flat. Not only is there no sense of the player having a lasting impact on the story, but it kind of just leaves everyone feeling bummed out, because their death just feels kind of hollow. And lastly, let's consider the tension, and here I actually think D&D 5th edition excels. The rolling of death saving throws turn after turn has a nice build up. It's tense, not knowing if a character is going to get their final failed saving throw or not, and it's all dependent on the roll of a dice. I'd say it's the part of the system which actually feels most in line with the current tone of the game. If I were going to lean into the more old school vibes of D&D, I think it would make sense to remove this timer for the game. But keeping it makes death feel dramatic and uncertain, and gives it the weight that it deserves. It also hands back some element of control over death to the group as a whole, which helps mitigate the lack of control that the player has over their death. But it's in a way which kind of forces the actions of the other players, which isn't great. Overall, I think D&D 5th edition's death mechanics are at odds with the stories it's trying to tell. It keeps many of the old school vibes of D&D alive, but then it tries to have its cake and eat it too by including mechanics to try to make it difficult to die through handing players a lot of ways to cancel the effects of death mechanics. And this is evidenced in how many DMs will go to great lengths to change death mechanics to either make it more interesting, less punishing, or more punishing, depending on which side of the fence they fall on in terms of how they think death should affect the game. So, D&D 5th edition is about 10 years old now. Let's consider how a new game which aims to tell similar stories addresses its death mechanics. And that, of course, is Daggerheart. Because Daggerheart is new, I'm going to go into a bit more details about how it works and analysing it according to our 3 factors as we go. In Daggerheart, when you're reduced to 0 hit points, you get 3 choices on how to proceed, which already implies that players get a lot of control over their character's death. The first of these death moves is Avoid Death, which simply means the character goes unconscious. The rules stipulate that the character cannot be attacked, so presumably they are then safe from further harm. However, on closer inspection of the rules, it actually doesn't specify anything protecting the character from environmental harms and the like, which feels like a bit of a blind spot in the rules, to be honest. So let's just assume the intention of Avoid Death is that the character is guaranteed to live until the next scene plays out. This amount of control fits the story, which is trying to ensure player characters stick around to experience the story. With regards to tension, there is none. But that does feel fitting, as you're likely only going to choose this option for relatively low stakes encounters. However, the impact of this choice feels very small for what is meant to be a game of heroic stakes. There is a chance that by choosing this death move, a player will pick up a scar. A scar can affect the character in the long term, effectively lowering the maximum amount of resource that the character can gain. However, the game does also suggest that GMs should potentially offer ways for players to overcome that scar, so it's not necessarily a long-term drawback unless the group wants it to be. The second death move that players can choose is to risk it all. When a player chooses this option, they can roll their hope and fear dice, which are 2 differently coloured d12s. If their hope die is higher, or the dice are matching, they immediately recover at least some of their hit points and get back into the fight. If the fear die, however, is higher, they just die, and they have no further impact on the story. While the move itself offers no control, the player does get a choice whether or not they use this move. As for impact, it's very all or nothing, which I think is good for players who like that old school vibe from older editions of D&D, but I don't think it works well for this game, where, as we will see with the last choice of death move, it seems like it always wants death to feel meaningful. As for tension, there is a lot of tension in the roll of the dice when you choose to risk it all. However, unlike D&D 5e, this tension is very short-lived. Keep in mind that tension isn't just about having a risk of a consequence, it's about the expectation of it, the build-up and its eventual release. This, I think, reveals something that's missing from Daggerheart, a dying state. Perhaps this is deliberate, as it can be difficult to make dying feel heroic. However, I would argue without it, there's little sense of a character being vulnerable, eliminating a lot of the tension which death mechanics tend to bring to games. I have one last death move to cover, and that is Blaze of Glory. With this move, a player simply accepts death and gets to pull off one last act which critically succeeds before passing on. This death move seems to be getting a lot of love from the tabletop RPG community, and at the risk of having a bad take, I think it's problematic. Here's why. In terms of control, it, in my opinion, offers players far too much control, to the point that I actually think it goes against one of the founding principles of Daggerheart, playing to find out. Playing to find out means respecting player decisions and how the story comes out of how those decisions interact with the game's rules. If players can simply achieve anything they want, they are essentially ignoring their prior decisions, which is fine if people get enjoyment out of sharing fanfiction about their OCs, but I don't think it's healthy for the game to be able to ignore the narrative just so the players can get the ending that they're happy with. In terms of impact, this choice is very high impact, but again, too much so. While the GM has final say over what can be achieved with this death move, I think it's incredibly difficult to ignore the wishes of a player attempting to kill off something like the big bad of the campaign with this death move, or at least affect the narrative to a point that the rest of the climactic scene is devoid of tension. And this brings me to tension. This death move for me is a tension killer. Not only because there is no risk involved in the outcome, but again, like risking it all, it's skipping over any stages of dying and resolving the outcome quickly. It's like it's in a rush to get the death over and done with. Before I move on, I think it's worth considering how the three factors apply to Daggerheart's death moves as a whole. Together, the three death moves offer players an immense amount of control over their character story's end. And I think a lot of people are drawn towards the mechanics because of that fact. And I get it. Coming from games with punishing and outdated death systems where character death feels meaningless, this system feels like a breath of fresh air. But I think it overcorrects, and in so doing, it forgets that the point of role-playing games is to surrender control over outcomes to the roll of a dice. Apologies to critters who may be watching, but the system feels like a tool built and made for the showrunners of Critical Role. It reminds me of how Matt Mercer can sometimes be heavy-handed in how he handles player character death or removing players from campaigns. I won't get into spoilers here, but I can think of at least two instances within Critical Role Campaign 3 where, for reasons outside of the narrative, the group wants to remove a player from the story. And that's fine. Considerations of the game are important. However, what I don't like is how their removal is dressed up as following the mechanics of the game. It leads to the story feeling inauthentic. And just like that, I feel like these death moves leave to Daggerheart's deaths feeling inauthentic. As for impact, the death moves are a bit all over the place, ranging from extremely high impact to no impact at all. And I think this is a problem, as this means players are going to choose what is needed based on their expectations for how the story should go. I can see a scenario where one or more players in the final moments of a campaign simply throw themselves at the enemy recklessly in hope of going out in a blaze of glory, and that feels like it removes any tension regarding how a campaign is going to end, because the success of the party is essentially guaranteed if they can just sacrifice their characters to get any outcome that they want. Which brings us to tension. I think the Daggerheart system overall does a poor job of this. It feels like it wants to resolve a character's death as quickly as possible, rather than giving those moments a chance to breathe. Now, none of this is to say that D&D is better than Daggerheart when it comes to handling death. On the contrary, I think Daggerheart probably pulls ahead a little bit in that regard, but I do think it's true to say that Daggerheart overcorrects for D&D's flaws, going from a system which feels punishing and low impact, to one which I would argue is far too kind and impactful, as well as brief. Whew. I think this is going to make for some spicy comments, so don't forget to get in the comment section if you agree or disagree with anything that I've just said, and maybe while you're at it, I think you pass like this little subscribe box as you're going down there, so maybe give that a click if you want to see any more content like this where I tempt the ire of the critter community. Which brings me on to my last case study. So, let's make death fantastic. This is the part of the video where I give my contribution to the community showcase being run by Peter and Zarek. However, they've each only got an attention span of about 5 minutes, so I better make this explanation quick. Before I get into the rules for death, or as I call it, ending a story, I should give a bit of context as to how players can reach that state. In Fantastic, when characters are hit by attacks and similar effects, they receive what's called damage. There is a limit to how much damage a character can take, and that is set by their health. Any damage your character takes over this threshold, however, spills over into affecting their dynamics, which is the game's version of abilities bonuses. They're called dynamics, however, because unlike ability bonuses in a game like 5e, they are, well, dynamic, which is to say they can be increased and decreased during play. So, for every point of damage you take over the threshold set by your health, you're going to lose an ability bonus point. What this means is that during play you can take quite a lot of damage, but then at some point you get to this cliff edge where you are really in danger. Because in Fantastic, when you lose all of your dynamics, that's when the rules for death kick in. When you have 0 marks in your dynamics, marks are what I use to track your current bonus, then you have 2 choices: accept defeat or last stand. Accept defeat is similar to the rules laid out in Daggerheart, but actually takes its original inspiration from Fabula Ultima. Simply put, your character accepts that they are defeated, and they can no longer actively contribute to the episode, which is like the quest that your characters are currently on. But also, they can no longer be damaged or similarly attacked, and the plot simply conspires to allow them to survive to see the next episode. I like to compare this to a scene in Lord of the Rings: Two Towers, where Aragorn falls from a cliff during a battle with some wargs. He's effectively defeated, and he's no longer a part of the film for a few scenes. But then, after that, he returns, having miraculously survived, floating unconscious in a river, and continues to adventure with the party. The idea of accepting defeat is that it allows for players to, well, be defeated, and for there to be a downbeat in the story without ending their story. Similarly, the whole party could accept defeat, in which case the plot conspires to save them all. Perhaps they are captured by the group of goblins that they were fighting, or if they were at sea, they might wash up on the shores of a deserted island. However, there is a cost, and it's the cost of one of your character's lives. Lives are basically how much plot armor a character has, allowing them to last much longer within the story. In most stories within Fantastic, it's assumed that you'll have 3 lives. However, if you want a game which is more punishing, you can reduce the number of lives, or remove them entirely, which I think raises the question: what happens if you have run out of lives, or you don't want to accept defeat? Well then, it's time to make your last stand. When you make your last stand, your character will immediately regain any lost marks and continue taking part in the scene. This is a very powerful benefit, however, it comes at great risk. At the end of the scene, you're going to need to make a difficulty 10 luck check, which is simply rolling a d20 and hoping you get 10 or higher. On a 10 or higher, your marks go down to 0, and you can no longer participate in the episode. However, if you roll less than 10, your character's story ends. Also, a character who makes a last stand and is reduced to 0 marks a second time also has their story end. And when I say end, it could mean that they die, but equally it could mean that they simply decide to retire or sail into the west, or maybe even turn into a villain and side with the story's antagonists. Whatever it is, however, they are no longer a playable character, and so at the start of the next session, the player will need to introduce another character of the same level. Of course, if all the characters' stories end, then it's game over. The story ends with the party's defeat. A last stand is intended to let players experience those fantastical moments where characters can fight on despite their injuries, and is reserved for when the stakes of the scene are so high that they can't accept defeat. We're talking like Boromir fighting on to save the halflings. Characters who are basically on death's door, but are fighting on desperately despite it. So let's consider these death mechanics with the framing of control, impact, and tension. I think in terms of control, this offers the right level for a game like Fantastic, where in most cases we aren't interested in characters suddenly dying because they lost. Instead, we want to see them carry on despite defeat. At the same time, it retains the ability for characters to truly fight to the death in a way which I think is actually missing from D&D. As for impact, I think this hits a sweet spot. Being able to bow out of a fight because the stakes aren't super high feels correct when the story simply isn't calling for the characters to go all out. Meanwhile, when the last stand is called for, suddenly being able to call upon your full strength again feels amazing and is powerful. But it's also consistent with the character's capabilities, and doesn't simply hand the players a way to automatically succeed where they wouldn't have ordinarily been able to do so. And then there's tension. The tension of accepting death is in accepting that the players may simply fail their objective, so resolving the defeat quickly feels appropriate. However, the tension of making a last stand and having almost a 50-50 chance of making out alive is incredibly tense. Not least of all because that tension is drawn out through the remainder of the scene. Yeah, your character might suddenly have this amazing advantage which may lead to them succeeding, but it's very possible it's going to be a bittersweet ending where their story ends because of that effort. In many ways, it's a fusion of the best parts of Daggerheart's Risk It All and Blaze of Glory death moves. It's guaranteed to be powerful, but that power is kept to reasonable limits, and it's very risky, but not to the point that the dice can simply make your death meaningless. So that's how I make death fantastic, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Do you have ways that you make death fantastic? Be it in games like D&D and Daggerheart, other systems, or a system of your own creation. And if you want to hear more content like this in future, please do subscribe. I'm hoping to use this format more in future to talk about game mechanics as well as what I'm currently working on. I hope to see you again, but until that time, stay fantastic.